Hello, Bay Ridge. Welcome to another edition of After Hours. We had a great gathering today as we concluded our series looking through some questions in the Catechism, and then a wonderful vision meeting. Again, thanks to Jer and Elizabeth and Stephanie and Danny and Dave for all the technical parts of it, and for Renee and the folks that helped her for putting on the meal. It was just a great time to be together. And since we just concluded the series on the Catechism, rather than kind of adding to the final teaching there on Jesus as the only Redeemer and Mediator, I wanted to give us kind of a glimpse into what's coming next. And what we're going to be doing next is a new series that we're calling A Father's Farewell. And it's a look at 2 Timothy. We'll be discussing why, we're calling it A Father's Farewell relative to Paul's relationship to Timothy as his son in the faith. That comes out at several key points in the letter. But we're going to be spending time looking at 2 Timothy between now and early May. And so I want to take just a couple of minutes to kind of introduce it and why it's important for us to study and look at 2 Timothy and why it might even be apropos for us right now. 2 Timothy is part of a group of what's known as the pastoral epistles. This is the common name given to 1st and 2nd Timothy and the book of Titus. They're probably the latest writings of the Apostle Paul. They're the last group. They come after like Romans and the Corinthians and Thessalonian letters. They're the very last writings of the Apostle Paul. And they fit together not only because they're later writings, but they have a lot of similarities between them. Among these are the fact that they're written to younger companions of Paul rather than to a church. So, for example, Romans is written to the church at Rome. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are all letters that Paul wrote to churches. In fact, many of those letters, Timothy is actually listed as an author along with Paul. But here, Paul is writing not to churches, but to individuals. And it's even distinct from Philemon, which is also written to an individual, but Philemon was not a co-worker or laborer with Paul, whereas Timothy and Titus are. And so Paul is really writing to these younger companions. Secondly, they're linked together because they're written to give instructions for how they are to lead the churches as the churches are having to deal with problems. Titus has been left in Crete. Timothy is in Ephesus. But these young companions of Paul are there to try and establish the churches, and particularly in Timothy's case in Ephesus, in a fairly well-established church, to try and have to deal with problems. So not surprisingly, we're going to see that 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus all share a common vocabulary that is somewhat distinct from Paul's other writings. And the reason's not because Paul didn't write the letters, as some liberal scholars want to claim, but rather they're written at a similar time frame. They're written to people rather than churches, people who already know Paul, but they're written to people who are having to deal with specific circumstances that are arising in the churches, some false teachers, some other issues that are going on. And so the vocabulary reflects this different time, audience, and situation. It's not that it's a different author, but the books really do kind of hang together as Paul uses some of the same vocabulary, some of the same conceptual ideas for what's going on in the church. And so they are a unique set of writings within Paul. So why are we picking specifically 2 Timothy to deal with? Well, it's the right length for us to deal with here. As I announced at the vision meeting on Sunday, I'll be taking a sabbatical starting in the middle of May, and this fits in very, very well with that. But even more importantly, we've already studied Titus in the past, quite a number of years ago, but I preached through Titus verse by verse moving through. And so 2 Timothy, it's time to come back to one of the pastoral epistles, and it seemed to be a good length to try and work through. But it's also because 2 Timothy is one of Paul's most intensely personal letters. Part of why we're calling it a father's farewell is you can really hear Paul's heart for Timothy and for the churches, for the gospel, for the kingdom. It's a very, very personal letter. And on top of that, It's also probably the very last words we have that are recorded by Paul. Now, Paul did not die at the exact conclusion of 2 Timothy. We hope Timothy was able to make it back to Paul to see him before he died. But in any event, it's the last written words we have from the Apostle Paul. And so what it does is it gives us a glimpse into the heart of the great Apostle Paul. As he believed his time on earth was drawing to a close, he was soon to be martyred for the faith. He was awaiting his final trial and eventual execution. What are the things that were essential to Paul? What did he want to make sure that Timothy knew to carry on after Paul was gone, and things that were important for the church? And so we're going to be looking at this. We're going to see what Paul's concerns were then, and we're going to see how relevant they are for us today in our own time, our own place, and our own situation. We're going to get to listen in as Paul gives this final letter, his final farewell to his young associate Timothy, his son in the faith. What was important to Paul then are the things that I believe would be important now, and we're going to listen in and learn together as we hear a father's final farewell in 2 Timothy. I hope this stirs up your appetite a little bit for what will be beginning this Sunday as we look at the first 7 verses in the letter. I look forward to us gathering for worship and opening God's Word together. I hope you have a great week. God bless.